Hi everyone, this is Matthew Janner for Card Runners, and I'm here with the Theory of Preflop Play, Part 1. This is the first theory series you should watch. I've made dozens of theory videos for Card Runners, but this is the first series where I'm revisiting an old concept. So I probably started working on the theory series for Preflop Play between 2 and 3 years ago, and since I've made a whole bunch of new content since then, it's pretty common that I get a PM or a post where people say, hey, I just like the new video you released. Where should I start for your old videos? And the old Preflop Play video could use an update. So that's what we're doing right here. So this is the first video you should be watching if you haven't seen all my old videos before. Or if you did just see a new video and you want to know where to start, this is the video. While I have learned a lot since I made the original series, a lot of the old concepts will be revisited again. So I definitely got a lot of stuff right the first time. Hopefully I'm a lot better at explaining it now than I was before, but there are going to be a lot of repeated concepts here. All my videos are now being designed to fit with one another, so concepts aren't repeated or ignored. So while this is a series that I have touched on in the past, you're not going to hear me keep talking about these concepts in all my future videos. We're going to keep going towards new content, and I'm not going to keep repeating myself, so when people do have a question, I'm just going to point them to this video. I'm alternating between making a out-of-position flop play video and a pre-flop play video at the moment. I'll usually only be working on 1 or 2 series at a time, and they aren't necessarily related. So just by the way things happen to work out this time, I don't want to stop releasing new content, but when I do release new content, people want to know where they should start for old content, so I do feel the need to sort of make this series better. So I'm working on 2 series at the moment, so you're probably going to see it released alternating between a pre-flop play series and an out-of-position flop play series. The out-of-position flop play series is much more advanced than this one. What concepts are planned for this video? The math behind defending against an open so neither the opener nor the defending player has an incentive to change their strategy. An extra amount of emphasis here will be placed on blind defense. So we're really going to focus on blind defense in this video. It's going to cover all of pre-flop play because it's not very different whether or not someone opens in cutoff or middle position or under the gun or the button. You use sort of the same strategy. A lot of people have been requesting a blind play series. This will get the pre-flop aspect of that done. So we have that working for us. The math behind 3-betting, 4-betting, and 5-betting. So we're going to touch upon this. The math aspect of this isn't going to take all that long, but putting the right hands in the right ranges is going to take quite a bit longer. And then the logic behind why using a very polarized range preflop is not a problem and when and why to slow play big hands. That's something that's new to this video that wasn't talked about much in the old series, so we'll definitely focus a decent amount on this. Let's jump in. Defending against a button open. Suppose it folds to the button and the button opens to 2.5 big blinds. How often do the blinds need to defend combined to prevent the button from being able to open any 2 cards profitably if they only defend by 3-betting? So think about that for a moment. 2.5 big blind open, that's pretty common button opening size in most online games. How often do the blinds need to defend if they only defend by 3-betting? Well, when the blinds fold, the button wins 1.5 big blinds. When the blinds 3-bet, he loses 2.5 big blinds. And note, we are trying to make the button indifferent to opening or folding the worst hand in his theoretically correct opening range. We thus only care that he loses money or breaks even with the worst hand in his range, which will of course fold to a 3-bet. Now this is a concept that a lot of people tend to get confused on. When you're trying to make your opponent indifferent between 2 lines, you're usually only focused on making him indifferent to a single hand in his range. So for example, here we're just trying to make the opponent indifferent to whether or not he opens the worst hand in his theoretically correct button opening range. We're never going to be able to make our opponent indifferent to opening a hand like Ace-10 or Ace-Jack or even a hand like Jack-10. Those are all too strong of hands, so that's not what we're focused on. We're focused on making him indifferent to opening with his worst hand. So here, if he opens with his worst hand and he does get 3-bet, he's going to say to himself, well, that's unfortunate. I just got 3-bet when I opened the button, and I have the worst hand I can possibly have. So he's, of course, always going to fold because he's at the very bottom of his range. He has the weakest possible hand. So that's what we're focused on here. We're not making him indifferent with his entire range, only the worst hand in his range. The math will thus be 1.5 times 1 minus x minus 2.5 times x equals 0, where x is the 3-betting frequency from both of the blinds combined. Solving for x shows 1.5 divided by 4 equals 0.375, or 37.5%. So here, when we set up the equation, we know that when the button gets folds, he wins 1.5 big blinds. For 3-betting X fraction of the time or at X frequency, then he's going to win 1.5 times 1 minus X, because that's all the times that we didn't 3-bet. Likewise, when we do 3-bet, he'll lose 2.5 big blinds, because that was his opening size, times X, which is the combined 3-bet frequency. If this math is something you're very uncomfortable with, like if you don't understand how to set up basic equations like this or use basic pot odd poker math, write that down in the forums and just let people know, and I'm sure you'll get directed to another video. This is not going to be a video that teaches you how to do basic poker math. There's already a lot of books and poker videos about that out there. So if you don't know how to do this, I'm sure we can point you in the right direction. While some people prefer to simply go risk divided by risk plus reward, setting up the algebraic equation to make sure we don't make a mistake and will train us to solve tougher problems later. So I'm a huge advocate of using the algebraic equations to figure out the answer, and I don't really tend to memorize the rules other people use, because the rules tend to get very confusing, especially when you're in different spots. So just try setting up the algebraic equations, especially if this is new to you. So what we just did was find our first parameter. Da-na-na-na. What we've just done is create a parameter or a guideline which tells us what we must do against other strong opponents. While we didn't solve for exactly what to do against a button open, we now know the blinds must defend at least 37% combined to prevent the button from profitably opening 100% of his range. This isn't really something that's debatable. You can't show me the ranges that you're using from the blinds against a button open. Show me two really tight ranges against a 2.5 big blind open and say, no, I think these ranges are pretty much optimal. They might be good exploitatively if the button's a complete and total nit, but you know someone's got to be doing something really, really, really wrong if the blinds aren't defending at least 37.5% of the time combined. This is especially true because here we're focusing only on 3-bets, where the button doesn't even get to see a flop when he opens and we defend. If we're calling, then we're going to have to defend a whole lot more than 37.5% of the time combined. So understand how significant this is. It's a huge deal. Now, the exception to this math would be if the opponent could open any 2 cards on the button. Then that wouldn't tell us we need to defend that aggressively, because now, maybe the button should be able to open any 2 cards profitably. So when we set that equation up to equal 0, that might not have been right because all hands maybe should have been profitable. But if you apply a little bit of 3-bet math, it will show you just how silly it would be if the button opened 100% of his range against 2 players. Both the players and the blinds can 3-bet really aggressively, and the button ends up having to defend an incredibly wide range against 3-bets, which, even though you can't prove that's not correct because you cannot assign an exact value to position, you're going to be pretty comfortable to say, okay, there's no way the button should be able to open any 2 cards profitably. When we cannot get exact solutions, and we usually cannot, parameters are incredibly useful for telling us what we can and cannot do. Parameters just give us guidelines for what we have to follow. They tell us around where the theoretically correct solution lies. It's very easy to use parameters to show us something cannot be correct, though rarely will parameters tell us what the right answer is. So here, if someone says, hey, I'm playing against an optimal button, and I think I should be defending these ranges in the small blind and the big blind, as I said, you can see if the range is too tight and be like, this can't theoretically be correct. Yet it won't actually give us the right answer. That's usually how theoretical poker works. It's awesome at telling us when stuff is wrong, and since we keep learning when things are wrong, we can slowly keep improving what we're doing. But it's almost never just going to churn out an exact solution. There are some exceptions to this, but for the most part, we're going to just have to use a bunch of parameters to sort of get a good idea of where the solution is. These restrictions simply guide us on the right path to becoming very theoretically solid players. Defending by 3-betting. Our first parameter gave us some idea of how wide the blinds must defend by 3-betting and calling. It unfortunately left us in the dark for what types of hands we should be 3-betting. So remember, even though we haven't explicitly talked about calling yet, we know that combined we have to defend at least 37.5% of the time, and also since the opponent gets to see a flop when we call rather than 3-bet, once we start calling we're going to have to defend quite a lot more. So we have a good starting point. We of course won't only want to defend by 3-betting, but how many hands we'll need to call will depend on how aggressively we are 3-betting. So remember, we're trying to make our opponent indifferent to opening the worst hand in his theoretically correct button opening range. If we're 3-betting him a whole bunch, we're not going to need to call very often because he's usually, when we defend, he's usually losing his open because he faces a 3-bet. If we're not 3-betting very often, we're going to have to call a ton. We now need to figure out what a reasonable 3-betting range looks like. Let's start by imagining we 3-bet the buttons 2.5 big blind open to 9 big blind and to 9 big blind in the big blind. That sounded like a really weird sentence to say. Let's start by imagining we 3-bet the buttons 2.5 big blind open to 9 big blind when we're in the big blind. When we 3-bet to 9 big blind, we risk 8 big blind to win 4 big blind. We already have 1 big blind in the pot as dead money, so we're only risking 8. But since that is dead money, we of course do win it when our 3-bet's successful, so we're risking 8 to win 4. This requires the opponent to defend at minimum 33% of his opening range. Conceptually, what hands should we 3-bet? So before we get into the more analytical stuff, let's conceptually talk about what hands make sense to 3-bet. We know our opponent must defend at least 33% of his opening range against our 3-bets, otherwise we can profitably bluff any 2 cards. So that's a parameter our opponent has with his opening range. He can't open so wide that he needs to defend more than that he can't defend 33% of his range profitably. So, exploitatively, that can be fine. If you're opening the button super wide because the blinds don't 3-bet, that's totally fine. Go ahead and keep doing that. But in theory, we know that the button must defend 33% of his range at minimum to a 3-bet, otherwise the big blind can 3-bet any 2 cards profitably, which does not make sense. Yet when we 3-bet, since our range is polarized, more on this later, our opponent will usually respond by calling or folding. He won't usually want to 4-bet since it will ruin his positional advantage when we fold or 5-bet all in. He has many hands weaker than our value hands, but stronger than our bluffs, which often want to call. So this is something that's very important to think about that players often get confused about. When the button opens and he faces a 3-bet, he's not going to want to 4-bet very often because when he does 4-bet, he's risking losing his positional advantage. If he 4-bets and the opponent folds or 5-bets, there's no post-flop, so the positional advantage gets completely destroyed. He never gets to see a flop in position. Even if the 4-bet is called, it's great to be in position for a 4-bet pot, but position usually gets more valuable as stack depth increases. So think about it for a second. When is it usually really bad to be out of position? Usually when there's really deep stack depth. So when the player in position does 4-bet, and he will do that some of the time, he's pretty much throwing away his positional advantage, so it's not going to be something he does very frequently. In addition, as we'll talk about later, since the 3-betting range is polarized, that makes him want to 4-bet even less, because now there's so many hands in his opening range that don't do great against a value 3-bet, but do really well against a 3-bet bluff, so those hands are of course going to want to call and get to keep the advantage of position. Since the opponent defends by mostly flatting, we want to 3-bet hands which do well against a pretty strong range from our opponent when we're out of position. So since the opponent mostly is going to defend by flatting, we of course want to be 3-betting hands that are going to be able to play out of position pretty well. So that means when we're value 3-betting, we're going to be able to sort of have hands that retain their value and do well against our opponent's strong hands. And when we're 3-bet bluffing, we want hands that have a very reasonable chance of actually outdrawing our opponent when we get lucky. And one quick thing I did want to point out is sometimes I'll notice I made a mistake in the slide as I'm recording my video, but I already just recorded so much that I don't want to completely stop, edit the slide, and then record it again. So you'll see me make a little ninja edit. I'll do that because I think I explained something maybe really clearly for the last slide or two and I haven't stopped the recording. So you'll just see a little ninja edit. I'm sorry if that's a little bit annoying. I do proofread my slides, but I occasionally make mistakes. So sorry about that. A conceptual 3-bet range continued. I used to, more or less, imagine all hands could be ranked in terms of hand strength. Don't do this. When you're first starting to play around with ranges, it's very tempting to want to have sort of a go-to range or a go-to hand chart so you can think about, oh, I need to defend 10% of my hands here. Okay, these are the best 10% of hands. That doesn't actually work because there's some hands that work better in some situations. You can't quantify exactly how good a hand is because equity doesn't directly convert into expected value. That's something so incredibly important to always remember, is just because you know the equity of a hand, you don't know the expected value. While some hands are clearly better, many hands play better in certain situations. So no one's arguing that ace-king isn't better than ace-jack. We're talking about hands where it's much more difficult to tell. So let's say the button opens and we have king 10 off in the big blind. Does this hand play better in a raise pot or a 3-bet pot? Why? Stop for a moment and answer that question. Do you think king 10 off is better in a raise pot or a 3-bet pot? And explain why. Because if you explain why to yourself and you're not exactly correct, it will help you fix other leaks. So pause for a moment and answer that. Then the next one is, now let's say we have 7 of spades, 5 of spades. Does this hand play better in a raise pot or 3-bet pot? Why? Once again, pause for a moment, answer that question to yourself. If you're wrong, or even if you don't completely answer the question correctly, it will probably help you fix other leaks. Okay, so king 10 off. Now, what does king 10 off do? King 10 off will pretty often make a pretty good pair. It's not going to make a great pair almost ever, and it's going to make an amazing hand pretty much never. King 10 off can't really make any really good flushes. It's extremely rare that it makes a straight. So king 10 off is going to be one of those hands that makes a pretty good hand pretty often. Well, when do I want to have a pretty good hand pretty often? When my opponent's range is weak, and when, his range is wide and we're playing for a medium or small pot. That's when I just want a pretty good hand. I'm not looking to have a set. I'm not looking to have a flush. We're playing for a really small pot against our opponent's wide button opening range. So when we call in the big blind, king 10 off is going to fit that bill perfectly. It does pretty much exactly what we want. Now let's look at 7 of spades, 5 of spades. This hand can make some really, really good hands pretty often. And when I say pretty often, I don't mean at a very high frequency, because no hand makes a flush or a straight or a set at a high frequency. But 7 of spades, 5 of spades is a really good speculative hand. It can, of course, flop. It can, of course, make 2 pairs and trips just like every other hand. But it also is going to make some straights and flushes at a reasonably high frequency. It's going to let us know, in addition, when we do flop a flush draw or when we do flop a straight draw, it'll let us know we should check call or check raise or donk bet so we don't end up folding what will eventually make the best hand. So 7 of spades, 5 of spades can pretty often make an amazing hand in a flush or a straight, and that's what we're going to need to win our opponent's stack in a 3-bet pot. In a 3-bet pot, we're not really going to be able to win our opponent's stack if we have a very marginal pair. But 7 of spades, 5 of spades in a 3-bet pot can flop, 5 outs to 2 pair or trips, or a straight draw, or a flush draw, all of which are going to be very, very useful for us. And we're almost never going to fold one of those hands, whether it's a raised or a 3-bet pot, because the hand tells us so well when we have a good chance to outdraw our opponent. Now, hopefully you're on board with me for all that. So now, imagine you're coaching someone or you're teaching someone else how to play who's worse than you, and he says, which hand's overall better? Is king 10 off better in the big blind, or is 7-5 suited better in the big blind against a button open? How would you answer that? They both do completely different things. One plays better one way, another plays better another way. Who cares which hand is overall better? It's nothing we can prove. It's just irrelevant. It doesn't matter. One hand works one way, the other works another way. That's it. There's nothing more to talk about. King 10 off is pretty clearly an awesome call, getting a great price preflop, but sucks as a 3-bet bluff. 7-5 suited might be a profitable call preflop as well, but it is more profitable as a bluff. There is no preflop parameter stating bluff your hands not strong enough to call, even though it can often work. This is something that I would say I had wrong in the first series I made, because I said this rule like it was a parameter, and we want to keep sort of the parameters we're talking about as very mathematical, theoretically proven things. When we get to post-flop, we'll be a little bit more lenient with parameters because we'll talk about stuff that we have to model and it doesn't work for every situation. But for right now, there is no rule that says bluff hands not strong enough to call, and there's no rule that says if a hand is a profitable call, you should call that and bluff a worse hand. Instead, consider bluffing when a hand is not strong enough to call and ask yourself if it makes sense in that particular spot. So once again, the rule can be useful, and it is something that you probably should run through your thought process, whether you're pre-flop or post-flop, which is if you have a hand just barely not strong enough to call, it will often make a good, bluff raise, but there's no rule that says you need to do that, and there's no rule that says just because a hand profitably can be called, it doesn't make a better bluff raise. King 9 off might just not be strong enough to call in the big blind, but it also likely makes a pretty bad bluff. So that's a great example of that. Now, I wouldn't hate if someone flatted King 9 off in the big blind there, but if you don't think you can flat king nine off profitably, it's probably not the right hand type to make a 3-bet bluff. So even if king 10 off is a really good call, and you think, oh, king 10 off is a really good call, surely king 9 off, which is just, a bit worse, is going to make at least a bluff. Not necessarily. It does not have the qualities we want in a 3-bet bluff. We want a hand in a 3-bet bluff that can outdraw our opponent's very strong hands by the river, and we also like a hand that kind of signals to us, to keep trying to see the turn in the river, like suited gappers do for straights and flush draws. So king 9 off just isn't the hand type we want, so we're going to have to fold that, even though it might just not be strong enough to call preflop. Visualizing value 3-bets and 3-bet bluffs. It's pretty easy to see some hands are clearly 3-bet preflop for value. Denying the opponent a flop sometimes and making the pot bigger are both good. For example, when we have jacks, queens, or ace-king in the big blind and the button opens. King-king and ace-ace are excellent 3-bets as well, just denying a free flop matters less with these hands. So you have to remember, there's really two things involved when you're 3-betting preflop, or if you're raising someone in general. You're both making the pot bigger and their range stronger, so that's usually something we're totally okay with when we're 3-betting for value. It's very intuitive that when we 3-bet queens, we're making the pot bigger and their range stronger. Our hand's just so strong that we don't care if their range is stronger. So that part's kind of easy, but you also have to remember, you're also denying them a flop, or if you're doing the raise post-flop, the turn of the river, with a large chunk of their range. So that can be a very, very good thing, because if I have a hand like ace-king in the big blind, and the button opens a hand like 8-6 suited, I 3-bet and he folds, I'm fine with it. It's not like slow playing ace-king was going to allow me to somehow win this giant pot. My opponent was going to outdraw me all the time there, and he had his positional advantage. So if I just 3-bet ace-king and he folds, that's fine. If he calls and the pot gets bigger, that's great too. So just keep that in mind. When you are 3-betting, you want to ask yourself, when you're 3-betting or raising in general, how much do I like the fact that I'm also going to make him fold some of his hands? Because with a hand like, pocket jacks or ace-king, yeah, they're very, very strong hands, but they're also decently vulnerable to a lot of the hands in your opponent's range, especially when we're out of position. It's also pretty easy to see how some hands play well in 3-bet pots and love it when they make the opponent fold pre-flop that still weren't 3-bet for value. So, 7 of spades, 5 of spades, and king of clubs, 4 of clubs both are good examples of this. These hands are totally fine when we 3-bet them and we make our opponent fold. Not a big deal. We like it when they fold. The hand's not good. Other hands are more ambiguous. When we 3-bet king-queen off and the opponent folds jack of clubs, 8 of clubs, or ace of diamonds, 3 of diamonds, we feel pretty good about it. But was the 3-bet preflop a value bet or a bluff? Because if we 3-bet king-queen off, we're going to make our opponent fold a lot of hands that have, more than 50% equity. But we also don't really consider it a bluff. So which one is it? Is king-queen off a value 3-bet or is it a 3-bet bluff? A lot of times that can be very confusing because if you're visualizing it as a value bet and your opponent folded ace 3 of diamonds, you just made him fold a higher equity hand in position, which seems a little bit weird. So we're going to come back to this in just a moment, but for right now I want to move on to visualizing a polarized range. In general, 3-betting ranges will be quite polarized. We want to 3-bet some very strong hands for value and some weak hands in order to make the opponent fold stronger hands. Clearly, only 3-betting strong hands would be very easily exploited, so we must mix in some other hands. So that's just a great way of saying all this sort of conceptual theory seems to be making complete sense. If we ever thought we shouldn't be 3-betting a polarized range, then we just only end up 3-betting strong hands, and then it seems like the opponent's quite easy, response is, well, he's just going to play like a complete and total nit. And then our cold calling range is going to be very, very, very weak. So all this conceptual theory should be making sense. 3-betting a hand like king jack off or ace 10 off or pocket eights doesn't seem like it makes much sense. It just makes better hands call and weaker hands fold while bloating the pot when we're out of position. Once again, just conceptual theory making sense. We don't really need to 3-bet these hands for value against a button opening range. Maybe in heads up, actual heads-up poker, like just 2 players pre-flop, maybe these hands are then strong enough to 3-bet some of the time heads-up, depending on how wide the opponent opens. But for 6 max, these hands aren't going to be strong enough to 3-bet against almost any button open, unless the button opens just ridiculously wide. This naturally leads us to wanting to use a pretty polarized range. So since we make the opponent's range stronger, it's really only going to make sense, for the most part, to 3-bet with hands that can still get value from that stronger range, or that that are bluffs that maybe make the opponent fold a better hand pre-flop, or can outdraw the opponent post-flop, even if they're up against a pretty strong range. Yet don't think of a value 3-betting to 3-bet bluffing ratio as a fixed ratio we can apply for every possible position, though usually it will be pretty close. Don't be afraid to 3-bet a hand that doesn't perfectly work as a value 3-bet or 3-bet bluff, though this should be rare. So in the old Preflop series, I was very big on getting this right ratio of value 3-bets to 3-bet bluffs. The problem with that is it assumes that whether or not a hand is a value 3-bet is kind of like a binary thing. And in reality, there's some hands that are going to work as super, super strong, super clear value 3-bets, like pocket kings or pocket aces preflop. And there's other hands that are a little bit closer, like king queen isn't nearly as strong. Even if it is still a value 3-bet, it's not nearly as strong of a value 3-bet as an overpair. So you don't want to think there's this ratio of value 3-bets to 3-bet bluffs you always need to have. Though in general, if your ratio is not something reasonable, like around 3-2 or 1-1, you're usually going to have pretty huge problems. So in general, when you're doing theoretical poker, the concept of using a ratio or a frequency is usually going to be very, very important. We're never going to be able to get away with 3-betting, 80% bluffs preflop, but we also don't want to lock ourselves into a mentality where there's this certain ratio we have to hit. If our range is including super, super strong value 3-bets, and not a lot of just strong value 3-bets. So, for example, if we're only 3-betting, aces, kings, queens, and ace-king, we're probably going to be able to bluff more than if we're 3-betting a very wide sort of value range of like 10s and better and ace-queen and better and maybe even some king-queen. So just keep that in mind that we're not trying to look at this value 3-betting to 3-bet bluffing ratio as this sort of fixed ratio that we have to always apply to every position, because we really need to look at every 3-betting range independently. Having said all that, most of the ranges are, for the most part, going to follow a general trend where you're going to have around 50 or 60% bluffs and 40 or 50% value 3-bets preflop. P.S. 3-betting king-queen versus a button opening range is a value 3-bet. So, the button opening range is very wide. He's clearly going to have to call with a lot of worse hands when you 3-bet him. So if you're ever talking poker with anyone, this will always be considered a value 3-bet. What we just don't want to do is mentally think, oh, king-queen is a value 3-bet, the same way pocket aces is a value 3-bet. Because whether or not you have a range that has a lot of aces or a lot of king-queen is going to greatly change how many bluffs you can have, because the equity difference between king-queen and aces is so huge. Alright, so now we're ready to move on to the restrictions of the 3-betting range. After we 3-bet to 9 big blinds, our opponent will have the opportunity to 4-bet us. If our opponent 4-bets to 17.5 big blinds, he risks 15 big blinds to win 9 big blinds plus 2.5 big blinds plus 0.5 big blinds equals 13 big blinds. So remember, all the money that's already been invested in the pot is dead money, so he's only risking effectively 15 big blinds because his other option is really to fold preflop. We're comparing the EV between him folding preflop and 4-betting, and so that's a 15 big blind difference. We must defend at least 46.4% of our 3-betting range when our opponent makes this 4-bet. This is another parameter for our defending range. Our 3-betting range must have this quality. So this is a very useful parameter. We know that if our opponent 4-bets to 17.5 big blinds, we've got to design our 3-betting range from the beginning that it can defend 46.4% of its hands at least. If we're calling, we're going to have to defend even more than that because our opponent gets to see a free flop. So this parameter doesn't tell us exactly what our 3-betting range is, but it puts a very important restriction on it. We also want our 3-betting range to have the following qualities, though not a strict parameter. So these are not just mathematical things we've solved for, but conceptually this stuff should make sense. We want the 3-betting range to be able to flop reasonably well on most common board textures. We want it to have some hands in it which can 5-bet bluff effectively. That's always great, because if we're going to 5-bet, we need to have a balanced range of value 5-bets and 5-bet bluffs. It's great to have some ace-x suited hands or pocket pairs that work really well for that have a lot of equity. And it's not so weak that our opponent can flat us incredibly effectively in position. If we start 3-betting too wide of a range, we won't be able to make strong hands on the river enough. So that's something that's much more difficult to try to solve for, but we have to keep in mind, if we start 3-betting crazy wide from the big blind, we're really going to end up with a pretty weak range that's just not going to have strong hands often enough on the river. So we need to make sure that we're not 3-betting so aggressively, that we're not refusing to call and 3-betting so many hands that our range just doesn't get incredibly weak for big pots. It's very important to remember the difference between like a parameter that we can't really ever try to get around if we're talking theory. You know, we've always got to defend that 46.4% against that 17.5 big blind. And then just one of those sort of conceptual theory qualities where we kind of all are in agreement. The parameters are usually much more strict. Are you freaking out about the 4-bet sizing I ignored? A lot of you are probably thinking a 4-bet should be much, much bigger than the sizing I just talked about. I disagree, and since this is a theory video, we're going to focus on what I think a theoretically correct 4-bet sizing should be. People, in general, suck really badly at bet sizing. I spent a long time working on bet sizing, probably more than anything else I focused on in 2011. Bet sizing is a very difficult concept. It's probably the most difficult concept in No Limit Hold'em, that and maybe out of position flop play. Those two are just tough. I cannot prove what sizing works best pre-flop. There are still too many streets left to act to accurately model the 4-betting situation. We get more concrete answers as we have less streets left to act and more polarized ranges. Neither is the case here. So, modeling is something that's very, very useful to do whenever you're doing theoretical poker, because you can't usually take every variable into account. But sometimes there's so much complex stuff remaining that you really just can't model the situation at all. So, for example, if we talk about an optimal under-the-gun opening range, we're not really going to be able to get an answer other than through trial and error and making our best educated judgments, because there's still too many variables, there's too many flop combos, turn combos, river combos, all the actions people can take post-flop and pre-flop to even come close to modeling it. Whereas in other situations, if we're talking about what bet sizing we should make on the river, that's probably going to be something that we can more accurately model because there's less to take into account. We're polarized, but there's still so many cards left to act. It's not like our hands have 100% or 0% equity. So when I say polarized, I mean really polarized. I don't mean just that, hey, we have a 3-betting value range and a 3-bet bluffing range. Now what I want you to do is think for a moment. Imagine you're playing against me or against, if not me, imagine someone that's even way better than me. Imagine you're playing against an optimal opponent. How much would you hate it if I made my 4-bet sizing to 17.5 big blinds with a balanced range? Think about it. You're 3-betting to 9 big blinds, and then me or someone better than me makes it to 17.5 big blinds in position. Now you either have to start calling a lot out of position, or you have to start 5-betting, in which case if you go all in, it's going to be a huge, huge bet, or now you risk being out of position for a 5-bet pot. My guess is you would hate it. Maybe maybe not. Maybe you would think, whoa, I'd love it because now I could call getting a really good price pre-flop and get to play a 4-bet pot out of position at a discount. If that's the case, then you can totally pick a different sizing than I picked here for the 4-bet sizing. This was just my best guess. If you disagree, you can totally change it. But I think it would suck a lot. Yes, you're getting a good price, but the hands which you can outdraw my strong hands won't outdraw me on the flop very often. And if you want to play a 5-bet or fold game, you win less money when I fold and have to defend way more 3-bets because I'm getting such a better price on my 4-bet. Keep in mind that even though your hands have a lot of equity, you can't just say, oh, my hand has a lot of equity, it should probably be a really easy call here, because you're not guaranteed to get to go to showdown. I'm going to make you pay a whole bunch of money on the flop, turn, and river when you're out of position. So even if your hand has like 30% equity against my, range, you're probably going to have to fold a pre-flop, and it's not likely going to be close. Do not think your hand's overall equity can let you calculate what pot odds you need to call. This is my biggest poker theory pet peeve. I'm actually going to rant about this for about 30 seconds, because I've seen people that have written poker math books get this wrong. You do not just take your equity and think from your equity you can calculate your EV, because you have to take into account how many streets are left, how much stack depth is left, a whole bunch of other stuff. Equity does not imply expected value. The same way you always hear that correlation does not imply causation, poker's equivalent is equity does not imply expected value. So even though you're getting a very, very good price pre-flop against my small 4-bets, you should say to yourself a lot of the time, well, even though I'm getting a really good price here, and my hand still has maybe 35% equity against my opponent's range, the problem is I'm going to have an absolute nightmare getting to showdown. It's not like I can just take this really cheap discount and get to showdown, I'm going to have to face flop bets and likely turn bets and likely river bets. And because of that, I'm not going to actually get to realize the equity of my hand effectively at all. The fact that there's still 3 streets left to act and I'm out of position makes it very hard for me to realize my equity. Therefore, my expected value of the call is going to be very low. So this 4-bet sizing is, of course, quite a lot different than what I talked about in my original preflop series, because that was just back when everyone 4-bet to 25 big blinds or so, which is not a good sizing. I remember when I actually thought a 25 big blind 4-bet was small. It's not. A bit more on the topic of 3-betting, 4-betting, 5-betting. Pause for a moment and try to clear your head. I want to show you something that is the opposite of how 90% of good winning players approach preflop spots. So, at higher limits, people of course understand this a lot better, but if you're playing reasonably low, this is probably something which should hopefully give you an aha moment, because most people are just so wrong on this. So clear your mind. Let's say someone raises first in. Is that range polarized? Why or why not? So think about it real quick. If it folds and the button opens, is that a polarized range or not? And then explain why. The answer is it is not, because the button is just going to fold all of his bad hands and only open his good hands. That's the dominant strategy there. There's no reason for the button to open 7-3 off. It doesn't do anything that his range needs. There's no reason to polarize. He wants to play all of his best hands, so he just opens his best, 40 or 50% of his preflop range. Okay, now let's say someone 3-bets. Is that range polarized? Why or why not? I'm not going to repeat the whole thing we've just talked about, but clearly that's a polarized range. It makes sense for a bunch of reasons. So now we have our first polarized range that's come into play. Now, what about a 4-betting range? How polarized does this range have to be in order to raise an already extremely polarized range in position? So this is something people do not put nearly enough emphasis on. If the 3-betting range is already pretty polarized, it's including some very clear value 3-bets and some very clear bluffs, it doesn't usually seem that good to repolarize against that range. We've talked about how we can lose our positional advantage when we do that, but even ignoring that, if our opponent has either a really, really strong hand or a pretty weak hand, when we 4-bet, we really don't give him that many tough decisions, right? He just either is like, oh, I have a really strong hand, I can either call or go all in, or, oh, I had a weak hand, I'm almost always going to fold, because his range is already polarized. By calling, we make him keep bluffing and such. Now let's talk about 5-betting. How insanely silly polarized should this range be in theory? You are raising an already extremely polarized range. So just conceptually think about it. The button opens, he's not really polarized, he's just opening all his good hands. Then someone 3-bets from the blinds. Now he's saying I have a very strong hand or a pretty weak hand that can outdraw you sometimes. Then the button 4-bets. So he's saying, even though I understand your range is polarized, I have some hand that's either so strong yet still doesn't want to give a flop, or is so strong and just wants to get a ton of value that I'm going to 4-bet now, and I'm balancing that out with some bluffs. So now the button's saying he has an incredibly polarized range. And then the blind takes it one step further and goes, I'm going to go ahead and be just absolutely ridiculously polarized, even though your 4-betting range is already insanely polarized to super strong hands and weak hands, I'm going to go ahead and 5-bet all in. That really shouldn't be happening all that often. Why are these ranges constantly polarizing so much against each other when calling is usually going to be more effective? Do you see how big of a deal 5-betting and 4-betting is? We'll come back to this later. So, I'm not telling you to never 4-bet or 5-bet. You clearly should in theory, and you very often should in practice. But I do want you to understand the significance of this and the language behind when it's going raise, 3-bet, 4-bet, 5-bet. What each player is saying about their range. It's a much bigger deal than people make it out to be, so just understand that significance. Alright, let's make some 3-betting ranges. I'm actually going to make these ranges with you right now. I've done it many times before, but I don't have it perfectly memorized, and it's probably beneficial for you to watch me make some ranges and hear my thoughts. This is not an answer key. We cannot solve for an exact range here, only use parameters to guide us. For free rolling calculations, check my quickie theory patch number 1. Feel free to make these calculations when designing your ranges. when you want to get very precise. So we've talked a bit about some parameters, some conceptual theoretical guidelines that we're going to use, and then afterwards, watch Quickie Theory patch number 1 if you want, and you can see how to run sort of calculations on your ranges and make sure your thought process is consistent and everything's making sense. So we're going to use all the theory we've already done to get us a really good starting point for the ranges. They'll probably already be really, really strong ranges, but if we wanted to spend more time and get more technical, we can make them even more precise. So let's get going. One other thing I wanted to quickly touch upon, because this is more of a math lesson than an actual theory lesson, is you cannot just add the 3-betting frequency from the small blind and the big blind and think that's how often the button is getting 3-bet. So you can see a little bit of math for it right down there. You can go ahead and freeze the screen and read it if you want. But if each player was 3-betting 18.75% from the blinds, it would result in the button only getting 3-bet 34%, not 37.5%. You can't simply add them, so just be aware of that. If that's still very confusing to you, go ahead and post that in the forums, and I'm sure myself or someone else will help you. Okay, so let's go ahead and start this range off. Whenever I'm designing a range, I tend to usually think, whether it's post-flop or pre-flop, it's easiest to start with the value component. So what do we want to 3-bet for value with pre-flop? Well, in the big blind, let's do the big blind first. These, in my opinion, are very clear value 3-bets. After this, it gets a little bit more debatable. You could even argue 10s are debatable, but I think they're still pretty comfortable 3-bets. But this is pretty much going to be the core of your value 3-betting range. Now, after we get this, we want to probably mix in some bluffs next, and then we can widen our range from that. So now let's start with, once we've got sort of the easy value 3-bets, let's start with kind of the easy 3-bet bluffs. So to me, I think these hands right here are kind of the easiest 3-bet bluffs. Now, you could argue that some of them are profitable calls, and that's probably true. I could probably call 8-7 suited at least profitably, but they work so well as 3-bet bluffs, I would rather 3-bet these hands because they just make, I think they're more plus EV as a 3-bet bluff. In addition, you could call with a hand like pocket 3s, pocket 2s, or pocket 4s, but I would rather have them work as bluffs because they, first of all, they 5-bet jam really well, which is something we'll talk about later. So it's sort of a pre-flop bluff that once we get 4-bet, we turn it into a 5-bet bluff, which is very, very nice. And in addition to that, we don't really need a set to beat the button's opening range for most, reasonable pots. A set's kind of an overkill against the button's, very weak opening range. So that gets us a start for our bluff component. And then we're going to have to add in some sort of suited kings. So, if I'm calling with king 6 suited and better, I'm going to go ahead and bluff king 5, king 4, king 3 suited. Same deal with the suited queens, and then maybe add in some suited jacks. And then if you remember, since we were value 3-betting about 4.6%, if we wanted our range to be about 60% bluffs, then that would get us to around 11% total. So this looks like a really reasonable starting point. And we would probably find, after we design the calling range and the 3-betting range, that it still looks like we're not 3-betting quite aggressively enough. So what we can do is we can start adding in some ace-jack, king-queen off and ace-jack off. We don't need to have all the combos, but we can add, some of them. So let's say ace-jack suited and king-queen off. So that gets us some nice, more value hands so that we can 3-bet bluff a little bit more aggressively. So we get to something like a range that looks like, give or take this looks like something that's very reasonable to me. If this seems very aggressive to you, then you can go ahead and trim it down a little bit, make it something like, queen 6 suited instead of queen 4 suited. But something around, here, between here, seems pretty good to me. Another thing I wanted to quickly point out, which is also why I don't like the idea of always visualizing a hand as a value 3-bet or a 3-bet bluff, is pocket 4s, pocket 3s, pocket 2s. We might decide we want to 5-bet jam some of those when we face a 4-bet. So on one hand, that means we're defending our hand, which is great because now we're not just, folding a ton to 4-bets, but we also don't want to really visualize the hand as a, value 3-bet preflop. So that was something I really probably didn't do a great job of explaining when I made this series a couple of years ago. So just know when you are 5-bet jamming a hand like 4s, 3s, and 2s, they do have a lot of equity as a 5-bet jam. They make very good 5-bet jams sometimes, but you don't really want to visualize it as a value 3-bet. It's not a hand you're 3-betting for value because most of the time your opponent's going to defend by calling. He's not going to 4-bet very often. But they do help round out your range. So this looks like a really good starting point, so I would just grab this, cut and paste it, and then be like, all right, here's big blind 3-betting range trial 1 for 13%. That gave us a good starting point of how much we needed, of what our 3-betting range is probably going to look like, and then we can tweak it later. So now let's look at the calling range for the big blind. I'm actually going to store this right here. Big blind, 3-bet range. So now let's look at the calling range. What's really great if you have a computer program is we can kind of see everything that we didn't click. For the 3-betting, it's going to be pretty obvious what we want to call with it. So I want to call with King 6 suited to King Queen suited, Ace 2 suited to Ace 10 suited, these suited queens, a lot of the offsuit hands. You'll notice I didn't 3-bet any offsuit hands as a bluff. That's because they don't really flop what I want all that much. You know, they don't really flop the flush draws, which are really great for 3-bet pots. So now what I want to do is try to memorize this the best I can, and then click this stuff. So Ace 2, King. And remember, we talked about how we're only 3-betting some of the King Queen and some of the. So I think we're 3-betting, we're flatting with this and this, if I remember correctly. This, and I think 9-8 suited too. If I do some of this wrong when you're watching the video, you just know that I didn't have it all perfectly memorized when I was trying to make it. So here we go. And then, you know, maybe these hands are close, but I'm going to decide to flat them, and then I'll tighten my range if I need to. You know, even Ace 9, I think I'm going to be able to make it work, because I'm getting such a good price pre-flop, and Ace 9 off, it does kind of suck, but it's going to play how I want hands to play in a single raise pot against a weak range, and we're getting a huge discount. So let's go ahead and copy and paste that. So then we have this flatting range. BB flatting range. So we've just used conceptual theory to sort of get us at a really close range. And then, as I talked about, we can later on be more analytical and detailed with this range and see if we want to tweak anything. Let's do the small blind real quick. Small blind, 3-betting range. All right, so in the small blind, conceptually, what's going to be different? We haven't talked about this yet, and it's not in any of my slides, but we can briefly go over it. In the small blind, we're going to be out of position multi-way sometimes when the big blind flats, and we can get squeezed. So if we wanted to make a really tricky small blind range, we probably could slow play some big hands so the big blind can't squeeze us super aggressively, and then we could check raise some of those hands on the flop. So we can take that into account a little bit now. But for the most part, we're just not going to want to flat as wide in the small blind. We're not getting as big of a discount when we do cold call, since we have less dead money in the pot, and we don't want to be out of position. So hands that I do think are profitable calls in the small blind, or in the big blind, like King 6 suited, Queen 10 off, Ace 9 off, 9-8, even probably 9-8 suited, those hands are not probably going to be profitable cold calls in the small blind. So let's just go ahead and make that range. So let's first do the value component of the 3-betting range. So that's not going to change almost at all. As I mentioned, if you wanted to slow play a few aces and stuff, that's fine. You could do that. If you want to make really detailed ranges, go for it. But for the most part, unless I have a really good reason to do that, I'm probably not going to. At least just in practice. So that looks like a good starting point. And then we want to think, okay, what hands do we want to 3-bet bluff? So what hands? I know I'm using that old rule, which is not a great rule. It's not a parameter, but it does help us sometimes. It will help us here. So what hands are not strong enough to call, so they make pretty good 3-bet bluffs? Okay, well, I probably don't want to call with even as many pocket pairs as I did before. Although, maybe these will get multi-way once in a while, so it might not be that bad to cold call. But since there's less dead money, I don't need to flop a super strong hand. I really don't want to call pocket pairs wide in the small blind. Maybe even sixes might be too wide, but I'm going to go ahead and leave that as a call. All right, so what else? A lot of these suited aces. You know, these suited aces, we don't need them. They're not going to be calls in the small blind, so let's go ahead and bluff that. I should have done this right at the start, but since we have about 6% hands we're value 3-betting, you know, a good estimate is we once again want to get to like that 13% range. So let's go ahead and go here. Let's go ahead and go here. And, you know, just clicking other stuff. Do. Probably even up to here. I don't like calling the small blind very wide, so we're just going to start off with not doing that. Even King 10 and Queen 10, those hands are close. Like, I'm not going to, I'm going to call with it. Jack 10, though, and Jack 9, I will 3-bet. So something like, oh, man, I'm already there. So since our bluffs, we can have a lot better bluffs here. You can see it's not hard to get, oh, wait, no, we need 13%. Well, it's still not hard, but that something like this looks reasonable. We have an overall tighter range. I'm actually going to go ahead and throw in King 7 suited too. This, to me, looks like a pretty reasonable 3-betting range from the small blind. So we're just going to range it. Boom. Small blind 3-betting range. And that was 13%. Started 13.3%. And then the small blind flatting range. So once again, we're going to just kind of freeze frame in our mind. Now, I'm not going to just flat with Ace 6, Ace 7, Ace 8 suited in the small blind, because these hands can't make straights, while ace-5, ace-4, ace-3 can. So I actually thought, as a 3-bet bluff, ace-5 was better than ace-6 suited. I imagine most people will agree, but just don't get confused when you see me not click those. So I'm going to try to remember this as best I can. Go like this. So something like this, this. Ace-8 suited, like I don't really have a strong preference either way. This, and then it was like 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s, right? Let me double check that. 9s and 6s. Oh, I guess we even had 5s. Okay, so we did not have many suited connectors, and you'll notice this board, like when we flat in the small blind against the button open, I'm really gonna miss boards like this. I mean, I'm gonna have sets. Where's my sets? Oh, this one completely misses me. So I'm only going to have a set 3.3% and an overpair once in a while, a very vulnerable overpair. We just are kind of accepting with this small blind flatting range that we're going to whiff low boards because we're mostly calling, hands that can flop 10 high or better. And I don't think there's really a problem here because most boards are going to be 10 high or higher. And I just don't think I'm going to be able to profitably play with suited connectors. And even if I had suited connectors in my range, like let's imagine, for example, I was flatting really wide in this, in this small blind and I had this range. My range is still really weak here. So it's really still not going to give me a lot of help because even if I make pairs of 7s and some straight draws and flush draws, what can I really do with it? So I'm just accepting here. I'm saying, you know what? I don't think 9 high and lower boards happen very often, and I'm getting a discount on my call preflop. For the most part, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with if I get a low board, I'm going to just have to check fold a ton. If you disagree with that and you think, hey, I don't like being that vulnerable on low boards, then you can try to make your range hit better on those boards, but it's going to be very difficult to do, and you're probably going to have to start flatting like some big pairs. So just keep all that in mind. I really wish I wouldn't have just erased all that. But something like this looks pretty reasonable, so once again, we're just starting off with it here. So here's the small blind flatting range. Going to cut and paste right here, and that's 7.7%. Okay, so we have that parameter we just talked about, how we know the blinds need to defend a total of 37.5%. So the big blind, he 3-bets 13% and flats 16.3%. Total is 29.3%. So that's decently up there, but a lot of the time when we're defending by calling, and then the opponent gets to see a free flop. So if we're calling in the big blind with King 7 suited, and the opponent has whatever hands in his button opening range, he's not really in a bad spot. So while he does he does lose his open when he opens a weak hand and we 3-bet him, he definitely doesn't lose it when he opens and we flat. He might still be unhappy to see us flat. If he's opening 7-5 off in the button and we flat him in the big blind, he's probably not thrilled about having to play a post-flop pot with 7-5 off, but it's nowhere near as bad as when he gets 3-bet. So keep that in mind. Small blind, 3-bet, 13.3%, and flats, what is it? 7.7%. So the small blind is being much tighter. You notice the 3-betting range is a little bit wider than the small blind. Conceptually, that can make sense too because the small blind has better 3-bet bluffs, so he's more likely to get there by the river. So total is 21%. So here, if we want to see how often we're defending against the button, it's going to be, the way we would do the math is we want to figure out like how often do both positions fold. So the small blind is going to fold 79%, so 0.79. And then the big blind is going to fold 70 point, why is that math so hard for me? 70.7%. So 70.7. Then we just multiply these two together. We'll go do that on a calculator right now. 0.79 times 0.707 gives us 55%. Equals 55%. All right, so to be honest, or actually it's closer to 56%. So we can say the button folds 56% when he opens. That looks very reasonable from all the theory we've done so far. So now I would want to run checks on this to see if I think I should tweak any of the ranges. And to be honest, I probably would tweak the ranges and call a little bit wider in both spots, though I wouldn't recommend most of the people that are watching in this video do it. When we're talking in theory, if you're calling from the blinds, it's assuming you know how to play super well post-flop, and it's assuming you know how to donk bet well. But in reality, that's probably some of the hardest stuff to do in poker, if not literally the hardest thing to do. So these ranges might be a little bit better. These ranges actually probably seem very wide to a lot of people watching this, but these ranges are probably a little bit better unless you're a very, very good post-flop player. So this is like something where if I were making ranges to, you know, move up in stakes and I was playing micro stakes right now or small stakes, this is kind of where I would start, and then I would just in the back of my mind be thinking, okay, I'm going to be looking for ways to make these ranges slightly wider in the future. So now that we have a good starting point for what the 3-betting ranges look like, we're ready to start analyzing defending against 3-bets. This one's pretty easy. We look at our opponent's 3-betting range, the one we just made, and we figure out what hands we want to fold, flat, or 4-bet. We know we need to defend at least 33% of our range, but we must defend some extra to prevent free rolling. So we're talking about those parameters from the past. Since our opponent was risking 8 big blinds to win 4 big blinds, once again, this is assuming we're from the perspective of the button. So if the person in the big blind was risking 8 big blinds to win 4 big blinds, we have to defend at least 33% of our range, and since we're mostly going to be calling, we're going to have to defend quite a bit more than that. Before we can make that range, let's first discuss a few concepts. Designing a 3-bet calling range. Our calling range should be designed so we can hit a variety of flops. There is nothing wrong with a flop hitting our opponent's range better than ours, or us hitting a flop better than him. Yet we do not want a transparent range. We want to be able to balance value bets and bluffs. So if we're calling with a range that just completely nails king-high flops and completely whiffs on queen-high flops, that's not going to be good, because our opponent's going to have a really good idea of whether or not we have a value hand or a bluff, because he already knows, wait a second, when Matt flats a 3-bet in the button, he hits king-high boards non-stop, so he probably really has it. But he also almost always misses queen-high boards, so it's very rare he does have it on a queen-high flop. So we don't want to end up with a transparent range. That's pretty straightforward. Having a transparent range matters less. As stack sizes get shallow, there are less streets to act, and the board texture becomes rare. Who cares if we miss a board texture that only flops around 1 in 20? I have many ranges that miss 7 high flops, and I'm over it, including the big blind flatting range we just made. If he's lucky enough to flop 7 high or lower, he'll get to make a pretty plus EV bet with any 2 cards. So I just talked about this for the small blind flatting range, but it also would apply for the big blind flatting range. My ranges are just missing the low boards. I don't have really any overpairs in my range, so my opponent's bluffs have a ton of equity, and even if I can have some sets, I don't always have all the set combos in my range because I like the 3-bet, the really little pocket pairs. So I'm just aware that my range is missing, 7 high, 8 high, and maybe even in the small blind, 9 high flops. But I also think to myself, that's rare enough that I'm okay with it. So I just guessed on the 1 in 20. I haven't calculated it. But a 7 high flop is probably pretty, is a pretty rare occurrence. So if we do miss that board texture, not a problem. If we're missing king high flops, or queen high flops, or jack high flops, that's likely a huge problem because those boards happen all the time. So if we are going to have a transparent range, it should be on a board texture that's not very common, so we don't get put in that spot very often. End of first video. We are going to pick up immediately from where we left off in the next video. No review. Don't want to spend the time and want to cover new content. So one of the great things about having more organized videos is I'm just not going to review stuff. We're going to just keep going into new content, and if you're confused, you can just go watch the old video. We will talk about some brand new concepts, especially slow playing, right when the next video starts. I also plan to talk about squeezing, cold calling, and some other stuff, but I know designing the 3-bet calling range is going to be what we originally start doing, and that's going to focus quite a bit on slow playing. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Feel free to give me feedback and ask questions in the forums. Please note I will not give out my exact ranges, but can try to help you with yours. So this is something that people just bring up once in a while. I'm not going to give out my exact preflop ranges. They're probably almost exactly like the ones I just showed you. But the reason why I don't want to give them out is I don't want to, I change them. I have changed them many times in the past. It's not something you can solve for. And there's just some stuff that I just don't want to give out in a printable sheet. So if you are making ranges and you have questions, feel free to ask me them. I can help you. I can let you know like what I do in a certain spot with a certain hand. No big deal. I'm just not going to cut and paste my entire preflop hand chart. So thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys soon. Take care.